Hi everyone, this is Gordon the Plant from gCreate, and I'm here to do a video tutorial on the slicing program called Slic3r. This is the first of hopefully 3 videos in which we'll show you how to download, set up, and use Slic3r mainly on the gMax printer, but it should work on pretty much any FFF printer out there. It's just that the configuration files we supply and the files and the settings we're going over work best with the gMax printer. Also, it works with the gMax printer bed size. But if you don't have a gMax, we hope you find this video useful anyway. Um, so basically, if you don't know what a slicing program is or what it does, for anybody who is interested in 3D printing or has a 3D printer, um, if you want to take a 3D model and put it into your printer, you need to slice it into a series of layers. And this program is what does that. So each layer that the program will slice basically tells the extruder on the 3D printer the paths that it has to follow for that particular layer. And then it'll raise up and do another layer, and raise up and do another layer. In this first video out of the 3, we're basically going to go over how to download and set up Slic3r, and then how to install the configuration files for gMax. We're not really going to go over the actual slicing aspect, but we're basically going to go over all the functions and features within the program before diving into actually slicing a model. We highly recommend you at least follow this along so that you have a general sense of what the settings actually do, and then you can go crazy with just changing them and printing all you want. But it's really important to understand kind of the fundamentals, because every time you pull a model in, there's certain settings that really have to change depending on your desired outcome. And if you don't really know which ones to change, then it really, you're not really sure what might happen with that particular print. Also, we really prefer Slic3r just because we've been using it for a while and it works fantastic with our printer. It also has a million features which are pretty easy to access, and they update it quite often, and as well as that they have experimental versions if you want to kind of follow the curve or be ahead of the curve anyway. Anyway, so in this particular video, we're going to be using Slic3r 1.1.7, which is the latest stable release. We're going to be downloading the 64-bit version of it, and we're installing it on Windows Vista. If you have a newer version of Windows, it should be a pretty similar process. You just might have to change some of the file paths and whatever, but it shouldn't be very much, or it shouldn't be different than the current setup we have here. Also, if you're using Mac, or sorry, or this is really geared towards Windows, because we don't really have any Macs here right now to do a video on. Lastly, this video is geared towards a fresh, I guess you can call it, install of Slic3r. If you've already installed Slic3r and you want to follow along from a fresh start, I'm going to show you really quickly how to clear out the old configuration files. But basically, for Slic3r, you don't actually install the program, you just run it. So there's really no installation. There's just a bunch of configuration files you might have to clear out. So again, if you've already installed Slic3r, I'll show you how to clear that out right now. So basically, you have to navigate to this folder. It's under C users, your username, then app data roaming Slic3r. This part here might be hidden because this is actually a hidden file, and you can search Google for how to show hidden files and folders, but basically this is where your Slic3r config files live. You will only see Slic3r files here if you've actually run Slic3r before. If you've never run Slic3r, these files won't exist, so this is only going or pertaining to the people who've actually run Slic3r before. And lastly, if you want to save any of the previous configuration files you've already set up, please back this up first, because once you delete this, it's gone. So, okay. Now we're going to go ahead and delete these so we can do a fresh, clean run of Slic3r. And now that's it. They're empty, and we can go ahead and close this. Now, we're going to go to slic3r.org, and here is the latest, greatest stable release 1.1.7. So, click Download Now, go to Windows, and we're going to download the x64, which is the 64-bit version of the Slic3r, and 1.1.7 stable. If you want to go for the experimental version, it's great that they supply the latest and greatest version, but it has some bugs and it does crash out sometimes, but you can always play with it if you want. So go ahead and click this to download it. Yeah, and I actually have it downloaded over here, so I'm going to go ahead and pull it over. Basically, it's a zip file with this folder inside of it. So if you open the folder, you'll see Slic3r, and then here's the actual program. Now, again, you don't actually install Slicer, so this folder has to live somewhere. So either it can live on your desktop, or you should probably put it in a location you're not going to forget. But basically, this is the whole program right here. I'm going to actually put a shortcut on my desktop, and I'm going to name it, because they change versions quite often. So there you go. All this is doing is just running the program inside this folder. So great. Now we can go ahead and open up Slicer. Okay, so if you've just opened up Slicer, you should see this configuration wizard pop up. Again, this pertains to people who have cleared out those configuration files. But yeah, so this is the wizard itself doesn't really help us, because when you actually import the gMax configuration files, it's going to overwrite all this stuff anyway. So you can just go ahead and click cancel, which is funny enough. And then you'll see this main screen pop up here. This is the fresh, latest and greatest clean version of Slicer 1.1.7. One thing we have to do immediately is that you'll notice this side here, if you take a look at it now, it seems kind of empty. Well, we have to change the mode. So basically you have to go to File, Preferences, and go from Mode Simple to Mode Expert, and then hit OK. And now you have to actually restart Slicer, and then you'll see a big change when we do that. So let's go ahead and close this and restart it right now. And sometimes it takes a second. But basically, if you're not in expert mode, you can't actually pull in the configuration files that we need. It basically will just keep it as a simple setting. But now, you'll notice, here's all of our main settings. Here we actually have drop-downs now that we can actually pick settings that we need. We haven't actually pulled in the settings from gcreate, but right now we have the option to do that. So now we can go ahead and minimize Slicer. And now we need to go to gcreate.com. This is where you can download our latest Slicer config files. So if you go to Downloads, now if you go to Firmware and Configuration Files, you should see the latest and greatest Slicer 1.1.7 config file. So let's go ahead and click that. I'll clear this out. And then you're just going to go ahead and download it. Now, I've obviously already downloaded it, so download that to your desktop. You'll notice that it actually downloads as a zip file, because we can't actually upload INI files. So just go ahead and unzip that file wherever you want, and you're going to go ahead and load it now. So let me go ahead and drag that file over. And then when you unzip the file, here's the file you'll have, is the Slicer config bundle from 10.14. Now go ahead and restore and open back up Slicer. Now you have the option to go to File. There's two options. One is Load Config Bundle, and one is Load Config. It seems like a few versions ago they had Load Config, and if you tried to load all of our configuration files, there's 17 total. Sometimes it didn't load all the settings. So in this newer version, I think 1.1.6, they added the option to Load Config Bundle. And this actually will load one file, but it'll have all the settings that we need that we supply. So go ahead and click Load Config Bundle, and then go to your desktop or wherever you save that file. Now you'll see 17 presets successfully imported. Great. With that file imported, and all of our settings should be there. Now, under Print Settings, Filament, and Printer, you should see many defaults that come supplied. Again, if you don't see this part here, you have to make sure you go to File Preferences and set Mode to Expert. Now, it should be noted that these settings here, these drop-downs, actually correlate with these tabs. So these are just quick ways to pick settings you've already created. And now these tabs are actually how you change all the settings here. So basically, under Print Settings, these are the settings you change per model. Basically, you want to change the layer height or the infill, etc. Filament is what filament are you using, because there's many types out there. So you'll see that we supplied you with a generic ABS or a generic PLA. We use ColorFab, but it should work with other PLAs. And then under Printer, this is your actual printer configuration. What size nozzle you're using, or do you have a dual extruder? So yeah, these drop-downs, as I mentioned, correlate with the tabs on top. So let's go ahead and jump into the first tab. So here's Print Settings. Under here, this is all of your main settings. I would say pretty much every time you pull in a 3D model, these are the settings you're going to change most. You might change filament settings, obviously depending on what filament you use, or printer settings you probably never touch, but print settings is where all the action is. So first, let's go ahead and look at 0.5 millimeter medium quality. This probably is the most common one you're going to use. It's a great general setting for all the 3D models you have out there. Um, First off, these different categories are all the different areas that you could change. So as you click down here, you'll see all the settings on the right side change. First off, under layers and perimeters, you have layer height. This is probably the single most important change for quality in your print. This determines how thick each and every layer is in your entire 3D model. 0.23 millimeters is about a quarter of a millimeter. It's also 230 microns, and that means that each layer itself will be 0.23 millimeters high. We found this to be a very great general setting between speed and quality, and obviously you can tweak it, but this is a really good starting point that you can then go ahead and adjust. If you go down, let's say you raise the layer height to 0.3, that's about about a third of a mic or a third of a millimeter, and your print will go faster because your layers are thicker, but also your quality will drop because obviously your layers are thicker, you can see it more. Now, in contrast, if we went down to 0.1, that's a tenth of a millimeter, and your layers will be much finer, meaning your outside kind of surface feel will be much smoother, but that's also 3 times as long for a print from the one we previously were at. So if you were at, let's say, an hour for your previous print, this one could be 3 to 4 hours long. So it really is a matter of, do you want to have faster prints or do you want to have a higher quality? And that's kind of the determination you have to make after every single or before every single print. So again, as a general setting, we keep it at 0.23. And next is your first layer height. You can adjust your first layer to be a different height from the other layers. We recommend setting this to be higher, probably 0.28 or zero point 0.3 or something around there, because if you have a thicker first layer, you'll get better adhesion, so your model sticks better. But also, if your print bed isn't perfectly flat, this will fill in some of those deviations, some of those gaps. So the lower we go with this one, it might cause problems. So we just say leave it at 0.28. Okay, moving along. Vertical shells are how many outside shells are in your model. Let's say you have a cube. Your cube itself, a solid cube, would have outside shells and then an inside infill. So this setting here would say, okay, let's have 2 outside shells. If you increase it, your model becomes stronger, but also your time sometimes increases because it takes longer to print that. And your filament might use more or less depending. Along with vertical shells, you have horizontal shells. It's actually more like the top and bottom layers, so it's a little confusing that they say shells, but basically you have a bottom layer of your model and a top layer of your model. So in the case of a cube, your bottom layer would be 2 solid layers and your top would be 3 solid layers. I've noticed that as you lower your layer height, so right now your layer height is at 0.23 millimeters, and you have 3 top layers, meaning you have 0.75 or almost for 0.72, 73 millimeters of top solid shells. So it's almost 3/4 of a millimeter. Now, if I set this down to zero point 0.1 and you have 3 of those, now you only have 0.3 millimeters. So meaning that your top solid layer is much, much thinner. So basically, the lower your layer height, you might have to increase these guys just a little bit because your layers are that much thinner. But if you leave it at 0.23 as a general setting, all these settings should be fine. Okay, next under quality, extra perimeters if needed, avoid crossing, all these guys. I wouldn't really mess with these. These are basically settings that they've changed throughout the versions of Slic3r, and some of them work fantastic, and I generally just recommend leaving it where it is. I guess it's worth noting, I haven't mentioned yet, that the tooltips in Slic3r are fantastic. So if you hover your mouse over, the tooltip notes are really in depth. So this should explain much of what you need to know. So if we skip over anything, and as we kind of rush through this because we're trying to show all the settings, don't forget you can always tooltip over. And you should actually, once you get a kind of a better knowledge of Slic3r, experiment and play with settings and turn them on or off or adjust them, because this is how you learn the most about the actual program. Okay, next is advanced seam position. This is, I guess, kind of important. Basically, as each layer raises up, there's a spot where the nozzle has to stop to raise to the next layer. And this creates kind of a seam on the outside of your model. In this new version, you can actually adjust that seam, so you can have them wherever the model raises up to the next layer can all be aligned or random or nearest. Basically, if you have them aligned, you'll see a seam on the outside of your model, which sometimes it's not a bad thing because then all the rest of your model is very, very clean. But sometimes if you go to random, what it'll do is it'll hide that kind of seam where it pops up each time, and you'll see little dots around your model, but yet your print overall around the whole outside will be pretty clean. So this setting, you kind of have to play with depending on your model because sometimes you can hide the aligned seam and it doesn't matter anyway. Okay, that's pretty much it under layers and perimeters. Now if you go to infill, this next one is pretty important as far as, I guess, the strength of your model. So as we mentioned under vertical shells, if you set it to 2 or 3, the outside of your model has that many solid shells. Now if you go to infill, because the outside of your model has shells, what's the inside of your model? In the case of a cube, you might have a solid cube on the outside, but the inside might be hollow. So you can set fill density to a certain percentage. If you set it to 40 or 50% or whatever, basically it's going to do a diagonal pattern at 40% fill, meaning that 40% of your model on the inside is going to be full of plastic. 40% is not bad. It's a pretty solid model. You can obviously go as high as you want. I don't recommend doing 100 because even if you want a solid model, 100 is just too much, and it actually makes your model kind of bulge out from the actual shells. So the highest I would go would be 90, but even a 50, 60, or 70% fill model is very solid, and as you print more, you'll realize that. And if you want to save plastic, you could always go down to 5, 10, 15, or 20%, somewhere around there. But it really depends on what models you're using because all models are different, and sometimes you can't go lower. Now, in conjunction with fill density, you have fill pattern. Now, the pattern is actually what pattern are you going to use to fill the inside of your model. We pretty much stick to rectilinear, which is basically going to be like a gridded pattern, and we have it set to 45 degrees. But you also have the option to do honeycombs, concentric. These guys you really just have to play with and see which one you like best and see which one works with your model best. But rectilinear is a really good, just generic pattern, we think. And the same with the top and bottom fill pattern. For the top and bottom solid fill that you see under layers and perimeters under here. So this you can adjust how you want that to look. Sometimes concentric might look cleaner or whatever. It really depends on what your particular model needs. The rest of these settings I wouldn't really change. Again, you can hover over and find out what they actually do, but I'd say per model we don't really adjust these. The next grouping would be speed. Under speed, as a good generic medium quality setting, here's the default values we set. The only ones we really ever change are external perimeters and small perimeters. If your model has a lot of very detailed external shapes or crevices or whatever, you might want to turn down external perimeter speed because that way you'll get a nice clean outside edge, and especially if you have a lot of jagged little nooks and crannies or whatever, then turning this down will improve the quality of your model. Whereas, let's say you're printing just a cylinder, well, you can probably turn this up to even 85 to match the perimeter speed because you're not doing very complicated little edges or corners. You're just doing a circle or very simple curves. So this one really depends on what models you're printing. But we recommend pretty much the only one we ever change really is this one and maybe small perimeters. The rest all seem to work really well. Bridges, a slow bridge speed, especially with high cooling, really does a great job. The travel speed we set to be pretty high because traveling should be pretty quick. And perimeter, acceleration, things like that. You don't even have to adjust those. But again, we recommend if you want, once you get familiar, play with them all. Okay. Next, under skirt and brim, this is how many times the print will start a skirt on the outside in the very first layer. This kind of gets the plastic flowing in the nozzle, and we recommend at least 2. If you have a really big model, maybe you can get away with 1 just to save plastic, but it's such a little amount that there's no need to change it. Okay, the last one you really have to focus on is support material. Now, support material really only comes into play if you have either flat overhangs or really extreme overhangs. We're going to go into that a little bit more in the next tutorial because that's where we actually describe how to actually slice. But basically, if you do require support material, here's where you turn it on. So click on support material, and this is the angle at which support material will be generated. So as you can see, 90 degrees is considered vertical. So 45 degrees is obviously 45-degree angle. Let's say you go down to 10 degrees, that's almost going towards a horizontal angle. So any part of your model that's 10 degrees almost flat will then have support material under it, and everything else will be ignored. Or I'm sorry, 10 degrees and below. Um, yeah, and the rest, raft layers, we generally do not require a raft below our prints. I recommend using a raft if your particular 3D model has a very small footprint on the actual print surface. Basically, let's say you're printing like a pencil, a very tall pencil or something that's a very, very thin cylinder. You might want to turn a raft on because that'll give you a lot more adhesion to the actual bed. But basically, for the majority of the prints, you don't need a raft. I actually printed roses for Valentine's Day, and the rose stems printed vertically in the air. And the rose stem itself had a very small surface on the bottom that I was holding onto, and it printed up almost 8 inches in the air. So I turned on the raft just to give it a little bit extra support, and then when you're done, you just cut it away with an X-Acto. So yeah, and the rest, again, you can play with different options as far as printing separate objects one at a time or multiple extruders. But really, there really is nothing that you should have to change other than just the settings I've showed you for under print settings. Next, under filament settings, you have the options to change the actual settings per whatever filament you're using. So typically we use ColorFab PLA for all the parts for our printers, but obviously there are many filaments out there, and we hope to add many more profiles for the slicing engine here, Slicer. But if you go into our online forum, we're going to be adding different recommended settings for different filaments. But anyway, this is a good amount of settings to get started with. And again, all of the settings you see in Slicer, these are kind of starting points, so it should get you going for what we recommend. So first, let's go ahead and it should already be selected, but ColorFab PLA generic. We use ColorFab, but this should work for pretty much any PLA. And yeah, there's really not a whole lot of settings in here. Really, all you're going to change would be the diameter of the filament is always set to 1.75. We never change it. Now, the temperature of the filament, depending on if you're using ABS or PLA or polycarbonates or whatever, this is really important. You'll notice that we set our first layer temperature, especially for PLA, to be colder. This gets you really good adhesion, but also it's not too stuck that you can't peel it off. So we found that cooling the first layer just a little bit now while increasing the other layers, it has been a great kind of balance between the two. So you'll see that the other layers are set to 208 standard temperature. But you shouldn't really have to change these for PLA unless you're going to a different material. And then under cooling, this actually controls the actual blower fan on the extruder. Enable auto cooling and keep fan on. These two, keep fan on is also negated by this disable fan for the first X layers. Enable auto cooling. Sometimes you can turn it off or on. We found problems with it being on or off, but it really depends on the print that you're actually doing. Basically, it'll adjust the print speed and the fan speed according to that particular layer and the printing layer time. Next, you'll notice that under fan speed, bridge fan speed, etc., fan speed as a minimum of 80% and a max of 90% has been a really good setting for us. If you're printing something with a lot of overhangs or a very small model, basically you want to cool that print as fast as possible. So these settings are great for, I'd say, medium-sized models. If you have a very fine small model, don't really tweak the actual fan speeds. What you should be tweaking is the minimum print speed, or I'm sorry, the slow down if print time is below X number of seconds. Now, what this says is if that layer essentially is very small, then it'll slow your print speed down, which gives your fan more time to cool the model. So you'll notice with very fine, let's say you're printing, again, like a pencil, as it prints layer by layer, because it's such a small surface area as it raises, it's not really cooling down enough. So you really might have to turn this thing way up to be like 10 seconds or 12 seconds. Or if you have parts in your model that are printing very fast, maybe this will fix that. But again, this pertains to the full print speed or the full time for each individual layer. So this might really be the only setting you have to tweak next to, yeah, that probably is about it. Okay, under filament settings, that's it. And as you generate more settings, you can save them by clicking Save Current Filament Settings and picking your own name or overwriting what's there. And then you can kind of create a catalog of what's good for all different filaments. All right, so the last tab you have is printer settings, and you really shouldn't have to change anything within this tab because it's all preset and it doesn't really affect anything other than the print bed size and etc. But the only thing you might want to check out, well, actually two things, I guess. Under custom G-code, you'll see that we've added a certain amount of G-code in the start of the print. Basically, I just want to point this out that it'll first home your printer, and then what it'll do is raise the nozzle by 5 millimeter. And what this will do is after it homes your nozzle, it'll raise it 5 millimeters so it doesn't melt the bed of your acrylic bed as it heats up. And then it'll obviously heat up to the first layer temp. So otherwise, if it didn't raise the nozzle, it would sit on the bed and heat up and create a little hole there. So you'll notice your nozzle raise. And then the last part is it actually moves to the center. I put a little annotation here. It moves to the center of the print bed, and then it'll lower down to just 1 millimeter above your layer height, and then actually start the print. So this little bit of code here is actually kind of what hopefully will save your bed from holes that are melting in there when it first starts heating up. And then the only thing you might have to change under any of these dual extruder configurations, yes, is when you do the dual extruder configuration guide, basically you have to adjust this extruder offset to your individual printer. It should be very, very close to this, but sometimes each printer is ever so slightly off, and you might have to tweak these settings very slightly to get a perfect balance for your second extruder. What this offset does is basically say that if you have two extruders, how far away is the second extruder from the first one? So when it actually uses the second extruder, it'll offset by that much. So basically, that's all the settings that you really have to tweak for each individual print that you're going to do with Slic3r. So yeah, we hope you found this to be a very useful tutorial. And if you guys like it, we're going to go ahead and try and do some more. But please check out the second part of this. And in that one, we're actually going to go ahead and load some different 3D models, slice them, and print them. And you can see what tweaking each one of these settings does. So we hope you guys have a great night and enjoy printing.